Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. Some really lovely announcements to make before we start today. We're very excited about what's happening in Vancouver. This show is looking spectacularly impressive. There is going to be a lot of things unveiled, revealed, launched at Fully Charged Live Vancouver in September. So if you are in the Vancouver area, British Columbia, or even the northwest of the United States, I'm sure you'll be very welcome to come and see us there. It's going to be a really great show in the Vancouver Convention Centre. It's an amazing location, such a beautiful city anyway. So we're really thrilled about that. I would love to remind people to, if you want to, and you are of a mood to do that, to leave a review on your podcast download app or on YouTube, if you watch us on YouTube, or on Apple Podcasts. You can leave a thing. We've had lots of lovely comments there, and it's actually really good for us to be able to see that, to make sure we're getting through to a big audience. And it's a growing audience on the podcast. It's really, often it kind of disappears behind the big show, but like a new car release or something on Fully Charged. But the podcast is really fascinating, and some amazing people appear on this show, and today is absolutely no exception. So please do leave a review if you feel that you have something that you want to say. I hope it's mostly nice, but criticism is always valid. Also, please do subscribe. Obviously, that's all. Everyone always says that, and it is boring and annoying, but it makes a difference. And we are getting more and more subscribers to it. And also, it means you won't miss another episode, especially because I use a thing. I don't know what I use. A Downcast, I think it's called. So I don't have to do anything. It all updates automatically. So that makes a difference. So if you haven't done that, it's nice to do that. Do tell your friends and family about the Fully Charged podcast, because it's highly informative, entertaining, and educational with a lowercase e, small educational, because everyone who listens to this podcast or watches us is frighteningly clever anyway. So you don't need an education. Talking of education, imagine if you were clever enough to attend the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, world-renowned, and you were a genius at science communication. That is how I'm introducing today's guest. Emily Pontecorvo now writes for a brilliant website that I've become obsessed with called Heatmap, which is basically they're following the same overall change in global technology, the energy transition, renewable energy, climate change, all those things. They're doing that on this really impressive website, heatmap.news, and we'll put all the links to this in the show notes. But it's Emily is an extraordinary woman, and we have a fascinating conversation. We cover many different topics, sometimes go down little rabbit holes, but generally we stick to the topics. She's really good. Again, desperately want her to come back when things have developed. There's a lot of stuff. There's so much stuff going on in the world. Really interesting guest this week, and I will join you briefly at the end of this podcast. But in the meantime, please welcome Emily Pontecorvo to the Fully Charged Show podcast. Emily, thank you very much. This is great to talk to you. I've been reading your stuff very obsessively for the last couple of days, and I'm very impressed, and I'm jealous, because you can get to the nub of the matter a lot better than I can. So I'm relying on you to get to the nub of the matter. Can we start with hydrogen, though, because that's something you've written fairly recently, I believe, the hydrogen story, because it is it's a constant drumbeat. So just quickly explain, I've been making this show for 13 years. The second car I ever drove was the Honda Clarity, hydrogen fuel cell car made by Honda. Brilliant car.
Right.
Oh, yeah, it was fantastic. I loved driving it. It was really comfy. It worked really well. We went to a hydrogen filling station in Germany, plugged it in, turned the lever, it filled it up. Took about 15 minutes, and then we could do another 400 miles. So there's no question it works. I think that particular car if you could buy it, which they never sold any, would be about $750,000. It wasn't cheap. But that's very unfair because it was a first generation, really, hand built effectively. And I think they only made a few hundred. I think there's some on the roads in California. But what I've heard all the time ever since then, I've got to say, mainly from men, is if they hear the term battery electric car, they go, oh, well, hydrogen is the future. But they've been saying that. I'm really old. I saw an advert for a Rover hydrogen-fueled car in 1963. That is 50 years ago. I'm still waiting. But I don't want to talk about hydrogen cars because that's just another topic and it's not important or relevant and nothing's going to happen there for a while. But there's clearly a role for it in other aspects of human activity. Or is there?
Well, that is the question. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to go too deep on hydrogen cars, but it is part of the bigger question around hydrogen, which is like, what are we going to use it for? And I think that question is kind of central to so many other. There's a lot of questions about hydrogen. That's just one of them. But where should we start?
That's right. Well, I think the background gist is always, hydrogen's cleaner. And there's no question, if you or I were walking down a street and every vehicle going past us was a hydrogen one, I'd be very happy. I mean, the floor might be a bit wet, but I'd be very happy. The air would be very clean. There's no argument about that at all. It's a much better technology from that than burning hydrocarbons. But I always ask, where does the hydrogen come from? Forget everything, the expense and the complexity of the machinery and all that. Where does the hydrogen come from? And as you state, and certainly is the case in this country, I think it's about 98% of commercially available hydrogen is basically stripped out of natural gas, steam reformed out of natural gas.
Right.
I don't know if that's the case in the United States. I imagine it probably is.
Yeah. Or coal.
Oh, coal. I didn't even know you could do that.
Yeah.
Because we don't do coal anymore here. But, so you can get it out of coal. Oh, God. All right.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's happening all over the world right now, or at least in the developed countries, is this conversation around hydrogen and how do we make it in a cleaner way? How do we, instead of making it from natural gas, we can pull it from a water molecule, split the H2 and O with electricity. And that process is called electrolysis. And if we can do it that way, the only emissions from that process are, oxygen, or there's no real emissions. But the question is, where does that electricity come from? And this process requires so much energy that actually, if that electricity comes from a natural gas plant or a coal plant, it's way worse than pulling the molecule off of natural gas to begin with.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Sorry. If you use gas to generate electricity and use that electricity to split the water, you're actually using more gas than if you just strip it out of the gas.
Exactly. Like it doubles all the emissions. So that's really the big fear right now with this transition and with what's going on in the US and what recently happened in the EU is figuring out rules to say, how do you know this hydrogen is clean? How do you know it's actually a low emissions process? And it's just really complicated because you can't, trace the path of an electron from a solar farm to a hydrogen plant. When you plug your hydrogen plant into the grid to get your electricity, it gets very complicated figuring out whether that electricity you're getting was in fact clean.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, an argument I can imagine hearing and not freaking out about is, it's certainly something we've experienced in this country. So in the time I've been making the show, again, 13 years, we were 40% of our electricity was generated by burning coal 13 years ago, and it's now effectively zero. And that's been replaced. Everyone goes by gas. Well, it has been replaced by gas to an extent, but hugely by offshore wind. I mean, that's the really big change that we've seen in that period of time. So you could argue that in a future scenario, you could argue that all electricity is renewably generated, so it doesn't matter. It's all the electricity in the grid is renewable. Therefore, it's, I don't know. I'm trying to come up with
Yeah.
positive arguments.
Yeah. And that's it's an interesting aspect of this. I think that's what a lot of these hydrogen companies are arguing, is that even if we don't get these rules right from the beginning, that, eventually the grid is getting cleaner over time. And so eventually it will be clean.
Yeah.
And I just want to back up for a second. This is all happening in the context of, in the US, there was a very lucrative tax credit created, where companies that produce hydrogen can earn $3 per kilogram of hydrogen that they make. It's a lot of money. It could end up being billions and billions of dollars. There's no cap on the amount of money that companies can earn.
And money is coming from the government, so therefore from the American taxpayer.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's this big debate about how are we making sure that money is actually going towards clean hydrogen. But so this idea that the grid is going to get cleaner over time, there's two issues with that. One is that in the US, unlike the EU, there's no overall renewable energy policy that's kind of bringing emissions down over time. Like, it's very piecemeal. Some states, like I'm in New York State, we have a renewable energy standard. So our energy is, in theory, supposed to get cleaner over time. But that's not true across the country, where we're relying on sort of these market-based mechanisms to incentivize clean energy. But there's no guarantee that we will actually have zero emissions electricity by any specific date.
Yeah.
And then the other issue with it is, and this applies, I think, in a place like the UK that you're talking about, where a lot of the energy does come from wind power. There are those times of day where the wind isn't blowing.
Sure. Yeah.
And what's filling in on the grid is gas.
Yeah.
And again, if your hydrogen plant is operating kind of around the clock without any consideration of when the wind is blowing or not, you're still going to be producing hydrogen at some times of day from natural gas electricity.
Right.
So that hydrogen is going to be pretty emissions intensive. And so, it gets really hard to figure out a way to kind of rein all of that in.
And it's also to devise, I mean, that's what I was reading that you were writing, and I had to read it 4 or 5 times to get to understand it. But I mean, the more I talk about the grid, and this applies all around the world, I mean, our own national grid here, and the way electricity is bought, the way electricity is generated and sold, and what we pay, and what the difference between what the generators charge, all those things, mind-bogglingly complex. And I've never heard of a grid anywhere in the world where they go, oh, well, it's simple. We produce electricity at 5p a kilowatt hour and we sell it at 6. No, that never happens. and the complexities of what you explained about how, a government department could ensure that the electricity that company X are using to produce hydrogen is from a clean source it's close to impossible, I think, is probably the fair way of describing it.
Yeah. And so, this recent story that I've written a few stories about this because this debate has been going on for a number of months now. But this most recent one that I wrote was kind of thinking about this whole issue of, where does the electricity come from? It's actually not unique to hydrogen. And we are going to start asking that about a lot of things as we decarbonize, about a lot of these sort of very energy intensive processes that are switching from, maybe at one point they were using, like in the food and beverage industry, they have boilers that run on natural gas that produce very high heat for some of their manufacturing. And maybe they'll switch to an industrial electric heat pump. And suddenly they're adding this huge electric load to the grid. And if we're coming up with policies to incentivize that or to subsidize that, how do we make sure that's actually doing something that's reducing emissions? Okay, then we're asking this question again. Where does that electricity come from? And how do we ensure it's clean? And it all kind of comes back to the same question. And so, there are a lot of kind of researchers around the world, I think, have come to similar conclusions about this, which is these 3 principles that they're not perfect, but they can sort of they're the closest that we can come to kind of making sure this is as clean as possible, that we are decarbonizing the grid while we're also adding demand to the grid. And that is these three principles of, making sure that when you're adding a big load, you're also building new renewable energy. So you're like bringing your own electricity with you. Second one is sort of it's called deliverability. And it's when you're building that new electricity, you're building it kind of near where you are using it. So it's kind of theoretically feasible that it's being delivered to your plant. The third one is, oh my God, I'm drawing a blank. Time matching. I'm sorry.
Well done.
And this one is maybe
yes,
one of
time matching. Sorry, that was a really good point. Actually,
it's really well done, important, and it's super complicated. And God, I just feel stupid for forgetting it for a second. But this is basically this idea that we were talking about earlier with when the wind stops blowing. It's like you need to make sure that your plant is operating at the same time that your zero emissions energy is producing. Yeah. So it's basically making sure that you're kind of matching with that on an hourly basis.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's what we're beginning to see now. I've had a few discussions about this in the UK because the kind of the installed base of offshore wind is getting to a point where on the stillest day, it's still producing quite a lot of electricity. And then on the really windy days, we're now up in the high 60%. So 60% of all electricity on a working day when there's industry working and there's big demand, it's all wind. That is remarkable. And they're talking about in the next, I think 5 years, we will occasionally go over 100%, which is what happens in Denmark now. And that's complicated and painful. It's not all good because that really messes up the market. But what that means is that if you were producing hydrogen, you would probably be able to produce it in a grid back up like that for most of the time. There might be the odd few hours in one day or one night when you can't, but I think that's going to be rare. It'll get rarer, I think, as time goes on. But but it's then what do we use it for? I suppose that's the next step.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of bring it back around to that.
Yes, thank you.
If you're listening to this and we're going on and on about how do you make hydrogen and you're like, but what is it all for?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and just to reiterate again, it's a complicated question and it's contentious. Like people are arguing about what are we going to use this for, because it does take so much energy to produce it in the first place. I think it's important to kind of highlight what do we use it for today. So today the main reason that we produce hydrogen is for fertilizer. It's used to make fertilizer, and it's also used in refineries, like oil refineries.
That's interesting. Did I know that? Can you quickly describe what's it used, in what way is it used in an oil refinery?
Unfortunately, I don't have the technical.
Right. Okay. Don't worry. No, I didn't mean to try. I wasn't trying to catch you out, but I mean, because I've spent 2 days filming in an oil refinery, so I know a lot of things they do. I mean, this is a long time ago, and I'm trying to think where they would use like hydrogen. I know they produce hydrogen. I've seen them. I've seen that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize they actually consume it as well in oil refineries.
Yeah. So those two industries are the two largest consumers of hydrogen. There are others,
right? Okay.
But those are the biggest user.
Yeah.
And so, before we think about any new ways that we could use hydrogen, at the very least, we want to decarbonize these processes. And maybe, I don't know if we necessarily need to decarbonize oil refineries because that's, inherently a paradoxical idea. But fertilizer, I mean, we're going to need to keep producing fertilizer and more of it to feed a growing population on the earth. Yeah. So, that's a really big priority. And I think that you can argue about all the uses for hydrogen, but that one just seems totally, you can't
critical,
deny that we're going to need to decarbonize that process. So that's a big one.
Yeah, and I mean, do you think has this discussion taken new importance recently because of the Inflation Reduction Act? I mean, is that something that has driven it more to the forefront? Because I mean, it's clearly not new. I mean, people have been talking about producing hydrogen from wind turbines for the last 20 years without any question, you know. But it's been ramped up, has it?
Definitely. And it's not just the Inflation Reduction Act. The Biden administration has kind of rocketed hydrogen up to being one of the key pillars of its whole decarbonization plan. Before the Inflation Reduction Act passed, there was another big law called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and that put $8 billion towards creating these new hydrogen hubs in the U.S. So they want to basically create these regions of the country that are where they're going to try to build up both the capacity to produce hydrogen and the industries that will use it and the sort of transportation infrastructure to, you know, connect these things in these different parts of the country. And I mean, that's another really like difficult challenge with hydrogen is we can start to produce it in these cleaner ways, but you have to make sure that there's actually, you know, buyers for that product. And it's inherently it's more expensive to make it this way than the traditional way. And so can you know, are they going to be willing to spend more on it? That's where this tax credit comes in, is it's trying to bring down the cost, make the cost more competitive with the hydrogen that we have today.
The IRA is such a huge challenge to every. I mean, interestingly, not just within the United States. I mean, it's affected people all around the world, and it's, you know, definitely there's some projects that were going to happen here. I mean, you can't blame the companies doing it. They're going, well, we might as well go and do it in Maryland or in Massachusetts because it's a lot easier there. You know, I mean, definitely it is interesting how the impact that's had. Has been pretty profound around the world, because that is the one of the questions of what is clean electricity, because that affects everything, as you were saying. I mean, it's not just. I mean, hydrogen is one thing, but I mean, if you charge your car, your electric car, you know, there's always been that argument, which I get. That's another one. I get a meme from an American every other day, is a picture of a coal plant with an electric car plugged in and someone going, oh, my car is so clean because I charge it with, you know, and you go, well, the difficulty is, even if you charge an electric car from a Polish coal burning power plant, the most inefficient and dirty in the world, excuse me, Poland, but you do have some grubby old power stations, it's still cleaner than using petrol. But that aside, I mean, it is a very important thing, and particularly if you're putting billions of dollars of government money into projects, then you need to know that. Otherwise, it's a complete. I don't even want to think about it. I mean, a nightmare. You've got to be able to prove or to be really confident that electricity is clean. But how do you judge that?
And that's. I mean, at the same time, I'll just, you know, add that the companies that are applying for this funding and that are weighing into these rules, they kind of disagree. Like they don't necessarily think that we have to get it perfect. That emissions have to be as low.
Zero right now, or whatever.
Yeah, because this is a brand new industry. It's capital intensive. Like there's a lot of sort of uncertainty around whether there'll be a market for this hydrogen, and there's all these supply chain issues around the world right now. Like, will these projects cost what we think they'll cost? And so they're saying, oh, the purpose of this tax credit is not to, you know, make perfectly green hydrogen. It's to get this industry started. And so, you know, they don't want these sort of strict rules, these three pillars that we just talked about, like time matching and the bringing your own electricity. They want to just be able to say, you know, we bought some solar power and we're doing our best, and we just need the extra funding to get this going.
We've got 3 solar panels on the 10 hectare roof of our factory. Yeah, no, I can see that. But then the other one is, which I think you've clearly looked at as well. I mean, the two things I hear a lot about are carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. So let's leave hydrogen to one side, but they're very interlinked in a way. I mean, they're not separate. But the carbon capture thing, let me just quickly do that, because when I made another TV show many years ago, I went to what was then the biggest coal burning generating plant in the UK, Draxby. It's absolutely huge. One power station generates enough power for London, and London is a city of 12 million people, so big. And they were burning unspeakable amounts of coal back then. This is 15 years ago. But they showed me the plans for their carbon capture and storage system. And at least, when I say 15, it could have been 18 years ago. It was a long time ago. They have done nothing. They haven't done it. No one else has done it. I also saw more recently in Imperial College, a big technical university in London, amazing, that produces incredibly successful people. It's a sort of our equivalent of MIT, which I know you have visited. I know you were there, sorry. But anyway, but they have a carbon capture and storage experimental unit in their laboratory, which they've had for 20 years. And they can show that it works, but no one's, I don't know. So I'm trying not to be hugely cynical about carbon capture and storage, and I don't know.
My sort of mantra when it comes to carbon capture and storage is we tend to talk about it as one thing, like carbon capture and storage.
Right.
Oh, it's never worked. It's never worked on these coal plants. But there are so many different contexts that we could be using this technology. There's the power sector. Within that, there's coal, there's natural gas. There's, when you hear companies like Exxon say, we've been doing carbon capture for years, they're talking about using it in a process called natural gas processing, where, it involves this sort of work that once they extract natural gas, there's some processing that's done, and they have figured out how to capture carbon successfully from that process. And then there's, other future ways that we might use it, which is like on refineries, on fertilizer plants and cement plants and steel plants and chemical factories. There's all these industries that right now we don't exactly know how we're going to decarbonize them.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll be able to electrify them, or maybe we'll be able to, maybe there'll be some other solution. But when you take something like cement, the emissions from cement are not just from the energy that you're using. There's a chemical reaction that happens when you produce cement that produces emissions. And that chemical process is inherent to making cement. And so to me, it seems reasonable to think maybe we should try to capture.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
So I think that's where I would start the conversation is, even though it has not made economic sense in the coal industry, in coal power plants, for example, which are going away and are just an economic boondoggle at this point. There are these other industries where we might want it.
Yeah. Because I think it's often used. It's sort of lazy shorthand in a way. It's like let's not change anything. Let's keep burning hydrocarbons like it's going out of fashion, and we'll capture the carbon and store it. It's a kind of politicians. We've just had it with our prime minister, and you just know that that's absolute. It has no foundation in reality. But I think you're absolutely right. The key industries that produce, particularly cement and concrete manufacturing, is hugely. The emissions are mind-boggling. It makes up quite a chunky percentage of global output, doesn't it? And shipping would be nice if we could capture a bit of the stuff that comes out of container ships that brings us our laptops and phones.
Yeah. I will say, like, you do still hear companies like Exxon or in the US we have Occidental that are saying, this is a way for us to keep producing hydrocarbons. So they do look at it as this opportunity to keep business as usual, in some sense. And So I think that it just gets really complicated because you have all these different conversations going on around this.
Yeah.
And each party has very different interests. And so it's easy to say, like, carbon capture is a lie that the fossil fuel industry is selling us. And it is in some circumstances.
Some aspects it is, yeah. But it's more complicated. Because that was great, that amazing story. And I hadn't heard of Danbury Incorporated. So they had carbon capture and storage systems, and they were bought by Exxon. Is that right? And then and that was a lot of money. And you see that headline, it's about $5 billion on that. And you go, wow, that's amazing. But then you just later mentioned they made $56 billion profit in that year. So $5 billion. It's like, it's impressive. It's more than nothing, but that context of in the oil industry, it is always the figures are always eye-wateringly enormous. And therefore, I have to say, the political power and lobbying capabilities of those companies is big.
Yeah. So this is very recently in the U.S. There's a company called Danbury, and they own most of the existing infrastructure to transport carbon dioxide around. And so they, what I was talking about before with this natural gas processing, that the carbon that's captured from that, this company Danbury will pipe it out to an oil field and use it to, it's called enhanced oil recovery. And they'll
get more oil.
Ground. And they own a lot of the infrastructure to do this. So Exxon just recently bought the company, and which suddenly gives them access to this big pipeline network.
Right.
And it's kind of this crucial, element to being able to do carbon capture, because once you capture it, it's like, where do you put it?
Yeah.
Where do you put it? And so now they suddenly have access to this, 1,000 miles of pipeline, and they can use it for enhanced oil recovery. And they can also, Danbury also owns a lot of pore space that's just for sequestration. So,
right.
We'll see.
There's got to be. Out of all, all the arguments about the finite aspects of hydrocarbons and oil, we might run out in 2290 or something, like many hundreds of years. But it's easier to imagine that we'll run out of space to store colossal quantities of CO2. That's a harder thing to get your head around. And I have no idea what that is. They're talking about it in this country that we've got all these North Sea oil fields that are depleted and we can store it in those. But it doesn't really go beyond that. And also some of them are like 200 miles out to sea. They're not like on the seaside. They're a long way away.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with what's the UK, but I know that in the US, like, there is a lot of pore space. There's a lot. I suppose
you've been extracting oil for 120 years all over America.
And I think just the geography or the geology of the United States is just more appropriate for.
Yeah. Well, you've got more geology. We haven't got very much geology here. You've got a lot. We've got a little slice. But that one, there was a conversation I had about air capture, like capturing it out of the air. And there's that, I'm sure you know about it, the system that's been set up in Iceland that is, and it captures carbon out of the air. And it's not doing it, it is doing it, but it was a year's worth of its capture equates to it's in the minutes of human CO2 emissions. It takes it a year. And that's the figure you had, a third, it's like amazing. It's 2 billion metric tons of CO2. And which sounds like, that is mind-boggling. That's a huge amount, but that's a third of 1 year's of the United States emissions. So it's on a scale that I think that is the challenge. The more I've learned, which I'm sure you're much more familiar with, but the more I've learned about the global energy system, the more overwhelming it is in a way. The fact that I have solar panels on my roof and 100% electric home and no gas at all is so tiny. It's such a non-event that I've managed to do that. It's taken me years to do that.
Yeah. I don't know though. You can think of it in terms of, comparing it to the big picture, but you can also think about all the people that you've told about it and influenced and taught, and
still feels. I think, I don't mean to be overly self-deprecating, but it does feel like it's such a, there's aspects where I can sort of see, and I mean, this is what I'm interested to kind of get to with you, is that I can see, no, we really could do that. I mean, this country is blessed by having this vast continental shelf around us. So we've got thousands and thousands of square miles of shallow water surrounding this island. And we've got so much wind here. We have 40% of Europe's wind in the UK. So we're very blessed by that. And you think, well, that is, and that's why that's happening. I mean, the scale of the wind turbines being installed right now in the North Sea is mind-boggling. They are the biggest that anyone's ever made. I've seen them. They are genuinely vast. And that is incredible, but that is very specific to this country. So there's landlocked countries in Europe or in Africa or in the United States. There's states that maybe don't have wind and don't have, all those things. It's so, I mean, because one of the things I meant to start talking to you about was when you were studying at MIT. So you were studying scientific, I'm going to get it wrong, scientific communication. Would that be a
science writing, science journalism?
Right, science journalism, yeah. But I mean, did you look at I suppose that when you were doing that, was that a broad spectrum of science activity? Yeah. It wasn't specifically to do with the environment or energy or any of those things?
No.
Because there are amazing things that have come. I mean, amazing. I don't want to go off on too much of an MIT tangent, but it's one of those institutions where I just hear about people who've spun out their industry from MIT or from research they did there. I mean, it must have been an amazing place to be.
It really was. It was, yeah. I mean, even just like walking the halls and peering into labs and seeing crazy stuff going on. It was amazing to be there.
Yeah. And so then because I've heard of Grist, because that's where you worked before Heatmap.
Heatmap, yeah.
Yeah. Which is great. I mean, I was very aware of Grist, and I realized when I saw Heatmap last week, I went, oh, I have seen this before. It has leaked into my world. But is that relatively new, Heatmap?
Yeah. So we launched in March.
Of this year?
Yeah, of this year.
Right. Okay. So that would have been early this year, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I joined pretty much at the beginning.
Right.
And we are a subscription-based site covering climate change and the energy transition, and from a scientific lens, policy, politics, culture, looking at the full picture of climate change and how it impacts our lives.
Because also, I mean, the other big thing that you've been writing about is heating homes. I mean, as I was mentioning earlier on, how you electrify where we live. Because I'm not absolutely sure of this. I know my friends' houses that I've been to in New York State burnt oil for heating. But is oil and gas the majority of the fuel that's used to heat homes in the United States? I'm not sure what the situation is there.
Yeah. Gas, some oil in some places.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But then heat pumps, there are a lot more heat pumps there than we have in the UK. I think you've installed more in the United States, I think.
That's a good question. I'm not sure of the comparison, but they're definitely growing in popularity, and they've been used in like the Southeast, in places like Georgia and.
Oh right, okay. Oh right, I'm doing my mental map going Southeast. Oh yeah, there. Okay.
Carolina, and like they've been popular there for a long time as like sort of air conditioning. We aren't really heating in those places. But they're definitely growing in popularity. I think last year was the first year that sales of heat pumps outpaced sales of gas furnaces.
Right.
So that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah. Oh no, you're way ahead of it. I just found the figure that you published, which is 16% of US homes are using heat pumps. And we're like probably 1 or 2%. I mean, we're all gas. Everyone has. I had gas here, so that's how you heat your house. But then, and is there, one of the things we've had here is the similar resistance to and criticism of heat pumps in a similar vein to the way there was about electric vehicles. They're for rich people. They don't work. They'll break down. They don't heat your home. Poor people will be forced to freeze by eco-Nazis bullying them into having heat pumps. All those, oh God, I've heard those arguments so many times. But is that not happening in the United States, or is that less of a thing there?
I think it is a thing, but the arguments are slightly different.
Right.
It's more you hear people say, well, we want people to have choice. It's all about energy choice. You should be able to decide how you heat your own home, and we shouldn't take away people's boilers. And then I think also, people question the same thing you were saying about electric vehicles. It's like, where does the electricity come from? Is this actually cleaner? It's also at this point, it's often more expensive to use electricity than natural gas.
Right.
Although that kind of changed last year when the price of natural gas got so high. But it's just going to keep fluctuating.
Yeah. I mean, that is because that is the efficiency of. I don't have a heat pump here, but the efficiency of heat pumps is it's like magic.
It is like magic.
Be allowed.
Yeah, it is like magic. And I think in a lot of cases, there's been lots of studies about this. In a lot of cases in the U.S., it will reduce emissions, even if the grid.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's got if you have 1 million gas boilers burning, what do you call them? Gas furnace. We call them boilers here. I don't know why. Gas furnaces. If you have 1 million. They're what? Sorry,
they're two different things.
Oh, are they? What's a that what we would use here? This is so boring. This is so unimportant. But anyway, what we would use here to heat our house would be called a gas boiler, as opposed to, and that could also heat your water. Same thing.
Right.
Do both.
Right. Yeah.
Your hot water. So I don't know what's the difference. What's a gas furnace then?
I believe the difference is a gas boiler produces steam, and steam or hot water, and so it's through pipes,
radiators. Yeah.
A gas furnace it uses like a forced air system to push hot air through like a dump.
Okay, that is different. Right. We don't have those here in the old country. That's much too modern for us. Oh, you're right. I've been in a house where there's hot air coming out the side of the wall that's what. I never knew that. Oh, right. Okay. You always learn something new on the Fully Charged podcast. Oh, right. I feel so embarrassed. I didn't know that. That's very bad.
Somehow I've gotten really interested in these very nerdy building science things, and I don't know if people care about the difference between a furnace and a boiler, but I think it's very fascinating. Well,
because I had some friends visited yesterday with friends of theirs who I hadn't met before, and they wanted to see how this house works because it's quite unusual still. And what is amazing is how quickly they lost interest. So they started out going, oh my God. And I go, and this is the battery. And those are the solar panels. And this is the water. By the time I got to the water heating and opened the cupboards and showed them the control system, so I'm like, oh.
It's just like a piece of electricity.
And that stuff has got to become, that's, I think the big challenge is education, is understanding what that means and what has been normal for us for all our lives, which is burning hydrocarbons, and what the difference is. But then also that it should become it's got to become normal. And that's and I've been an early adopter of that. And that is not necessarily good because I'll be obsessed with it and checking how much energy I'm using and looking at the app and changing this. And, normal people shouldn't be doing that. It should just be, where's the button that turns it on? Right. And where's the one that turns it off? Right. That's all I need to know. That's got to happen.
I think that there is an argument for normal people to get more invested in how these systems work, because you can save a lot of money by, kind of optimizing these systems. And so if it becomes more user friendly to have an app where you're sort of tracking these things, I think it could be something that people become more interested in.
I think so, because it is that thing that we've taken for granted. That's the one thing I think is a fair criticism that all human beings above the age of probably 25, we've all taken burning hydrocarbons for granted. It's just normal. That's what we've always done. It's what our parents did, it's what our grandparents did. It goes back generations. And changing that is really hard. Which is what you're dealing with. That's what's extraordinary about your site is it does seem to cover a lot of the things that we don't go into, which I would like to. I mean, I'm obsessed with all of that. It's very easy. Can you tell? I mean, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but can you tell me where you see the most hope for technology to genuinely make an impact, and where you see the most difficulty? Is that possible?
Wow, that's a big question.
It's huge.
Gosh, I mean, it's hard to pick one for hope. I think that there's so much happening right now that's exciting. I mean, the story of renewable energy is sort of an obvious answer, but just the way that it continues to get cheaper. And, right now, I think in the US, we have this big bottleneck around transmission, and that's going to slow things down a little bit. But, we have the technology and we're building it and it's happening. It's amazing. Yeah. I see a lot of hope. I honestly see a lot of hope in state policy. I think some states like New York, California, Illinois, Colorado, so these states are really at the forefront of dealing with some of the hardest challenges around how are we going to do this? How are we going to bring emissions down to net zero? Right. And so I just think it's incredibly exciting that they're really grappling with those problems and coming up with solutions and testing them out and being these sort of kind of clearing the way for others to follow.
Yeah.
And then I also see a lot of hope in what we were just talking about with home electrification. I think this is something that is starting to become, the public is starting to become more familiar with. And especially now with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of incentives, financial incentives to do this. And so it will only become more on people's radar. And I think it's one of these few areas of your life where you really can say, like, I'm going to stop using fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I mean, it's expensive and it takes a big investment, and not everyone can do that. But if you can and you want to, you really can just cut fossil fuels out of your home. And that's, I think, for people to be able to engage with climate on that level, it's like for so long, people are like, what can I do? What can I do? This is something they can do.
Yeah. And surely, I mean, I would imagine this is what I don't know about it. But in this country, it would be once you've installed a heat pump, which costs money, it's definitely cheaper to heat your home using that because gas is expensive, electricity is cheaper, and also you can use it. We have remarkably flexible tariffs that you pay for electricity. So I pay very little for electricity at night, but I pay extra above that in the day. Well, I can mitigate that because I've got batteries and solar. So I actually pay, which I think is unfair. And I think this is another aspect, is the social aspect of it, that I'm wealthy enough to put those things on my house, and I end up with a much lower electricity bill than a very poorly paid working class family who live 10 miles up the road, who've got bad insulation, no solar panels, and have to pay higher bills. And you just go, that is going to take some leveling out, the spread of that technology, which I'm sure is the same issues in the United States. I mean, it's...
Yeah, it's a little different. I think for a lot of people, depending on where you live, but it's not just the upfront cost. The kind of monthly bill might be higher because gas is so cheap. I mean, I don't know how I actually don't know how it compares at this current moment of time.
Yes, I don't either. No, I don't.
It's fluctuated so much in the past couple of years, but it can be a higher cost. But there's all these other things things you can do to improve efficiency, and I think there are ways that you can bring that down.
Yeah, I mean, recently our biggest gas supplier, who supply people's homes with gas, have just made their biggest profits ever in their history, and they've been going a long time. So there is that aspect, which is often, and the oil industry are not doing too badly at the moment. I don't think they're not suffering too much. Okay, so I'm just wondering where you see the biggest challenge then. Not necessarily that it's bad or, but just the biggest challenge. Have you got a favorite big challenge?
Politics. It's
I was trying not to mention the P word.
I mean, it's in the US, like we're we're pretty far behind the UK and Europe, I think, in terms of our policy.
We've been trying desperately to catch up in the last few years. Believe me, in this country, not in Europe. That's a different matter because we're no longer part of Europe. We're actually, I think, we're the 56th state or something. We're basically America with a bigger C.
Yeah, but I think there's no one knows what's going to happen in a couple of years right now, and if the political environment shifts again, a lot of the progress that we've made in the past couple of years we could back
unravel a bit.
on.
Yeah.
So there's that. I think.
But
actually, what I'm most afraid of is that things like heat pumps and electric vehicles and all these solutions that they're not. It's not going to be perfect, and some people are going to have bad experiences, and it's going to cost a lot of money, and that could really just backfire and sort of like make people feel really frustrated with this transition and feel like they're spending all this money and they're doing the right thing, but it's not, their quality of life has not improved. It's actually gotten worse. And I think that we could, see a lot of backlash to clean energy policies because of that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. And I also think on the flip side of that in fact, from my limited experience, the industrial transition is probably likely to be more successful. The companies that have made that shift. I mean, a boring example, but quite a good one, is Amazon in this country. Amazon deliveries. There's now, I think, 2 of their big distribution centers are hugely over solar powered, and all their delivery vans for their last 50-mile deliveries are all electric, not like 1 or 2. All of them are, and they managed to use that. They use vehicle to distribution center. So they're running the distribution center at night from the batteries in, all that stuff is starting to happen. And that has proven very successful, very economically advantageous to those companies. They save a huge amount of money. So on a big macro scale, you can see it kind of working. And then you see, a guy I meet at a charger that doesn't work, who's frustrated in his electric car and going, why did I buy this? That you can see is the painful thing. I mean, it'll get better. I mean, I know it has got better in the time I've been doing this, but you're right. And I mean, just to end up on, because I'm sure that I'm going to see loads of other things I'm going to see in my notes now after we finish. We've covered quite a lot of it, but I just wonder, is there without giving it away, I don't want you to spoil your next project, but what are the areas that you're looking at in the near future in terms of new articles and things?
Well, I'm very excited. When I get off this call, I'm going to talk to some scientists about the superconductor news.
Oh, yes, that's interesting.
That's pretty exciting. I mean, that's, of course, no one knows right now really what that's going to mean, but it's just a pretty exciting thing that's happening. We're going to keep covering the Inflation Reduction Act. There's so much that's going to be happening over the next year. I mean, we were talking about hydrogen earlier. These rules are going to be published soon, I think in the next couple of weeks or the next month, that's, basically say how we're going to prove that it's clean. And I'm really eager to see where our government, falls on that debate. And so there's that. And then there'll be recently, the Inflation Reduction Act has both tax credits and rebates for home improvement. So for heat pumps and chargers and induction stoves. And the rebates, that money was just recently released to states. And so states are going to start setting up programs for that, and be very interested to follow kind of how those work out. And then I'll just flag one other thing. There's so many interesting labor stories happening around the energy transition in the U.S. There's a huge labor fight right now between our auto workers union and our big 3 automakers, and they're renegotiating a contract. And as part of that, they're really trying to get protections for electric vehicle workers.
Right.
And then we didn't get a chance to talk about this very much, but there's just a lot of workforce development that needs to happen to make sure we actually have people prepared to do all of this decarbonization work.
I've just seen, as you were saying that, I just saw down on my notes, heavily underlined, skills shortage, which we didn't. Right, yeah. No, and that's universal. I mean, that's here. I know I've spent time in Australia. I know it's there. It's definitely, that's very, it's a very important thing. And I mean, what's annoying about it, in a sense of, I've lived through periods of really high unemployment in this country, really problematic, huge amounts of people unemployed. And at the moment, there's exactly the opposite. There's a desperate need for more people to work in this sector, and there's a huge shortage of skills and abilities to work in it. And it's, which I assume is pretty similar to the United States. I mean, we need a lot of electricians, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. That has been brilliant, Emily. Thank you so much. It's been a bit. We've jumped about quite a lot, but we've covered some interesting stuff, and I'm really fascinated to read more that you write. And so we'll definitely put links to Heatmap in the show notes, as they say.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. It was really fun to talk to you about this stuff, and we are covering all of the biggest climate stories at Heatmap. So it's www.heatmap.news.
Well done. Good. Get that.
We are on all social media. Please check us out.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed that. It was really fascinating talking to Emily, an amazing woman. And definitely we're going to try and get her back on the show at some point, because she's she has a very interesting take on things, as you can tell. That's it. I'm not going to say anything else. That's it. Please do join us again. And as always, if you have been, thank you for listening.